Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
So this week we're talking about something that I think most people have experienced or seen at some level, whether that's driving around or maybe walking around, maybe it's even in the store. Specifically, we're talking about mental illness, but more specifically really than that, what happens when someone with mental illness is accused of a crime. That is at the heart of a recent Larry Barker investigation. The topic, which is tied to criminal competency, is something as well, Gabby, that you covered extensively in part of your investigative work here at KRQE.
Yeah, when someone's deemed incompetent to stand trial in court, how does New Mexico's criminal justice system deal with those who are mentally ill, but they're still committing crimes? And just how big is the problem in New Mexico? Let's dive in and introduce our two returning guests to the podcast. We have veteran KRQE investigative reporter Larry Barker and University of New Mexico criminal law professor Joshua Kastenberg. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Larry, your recent investigation is titled Free Rides on the New Mexico Justice Train. It's online at krqe.com and our KRQE YouTube channel. We will link to that in our show notes if anyone hasn't seen it yet. But first, Larry, tell us what led you down the path of taking a deep dive into this issue in the first place?
This came to our attention really last fall. Actually, it was the Public Defender's Office who brought the issue to our attention. It really opened my eyes. I was not aware of the extent of the problem. And we're talking about mentally ill individuals who are arrested and charged with criminal offenses and are mentally ill, found to be incompetent, and what happens to them in the justice system. And what our findings were is, for the most part, they're released back into the community, only to commit crimes again and again and again.
Yeah.
You have a giant list in front of you. You were looking down at this when we were talking about the issue. I imagine this is a big part of it.
Yeah, this is really our master list. It's a computer printout. And what we did is we looked at the criminal justice system, and we wanted to see individuals who are in the criminal justice system. That is, they have been a criminal case has been filed against them. They have been found to be incompetent, and they have more than 5 cases. So that's what this database is. And this is not just Albuquerque. This is statewide, right, this list. And there are hundreds of individuals on the list. What we did in our investigation is we decided to focus on about 24 individuals with a mix of felony and misdemeanor cases, but with multiple cases. Every one of these individuals has been found to be incompetent, and Professor Kastenberg can explain really what that means to our viewers. But
it's a lot.
It is a ton of individuals. We just focused on really about 24, and we just drilled down on those cases to find out what happened to these individuals in the system.
Yeah. Well, and Professor Kastenberg, let's talk a little bit to you and your background and expertise on this issue. We mentioned you're a professor over there at UNM. What is your expertise again on this issue?
Well, before I became a professor at the university, I was you could say a career prosecutor. I served for a brief period of time as a trial judge. And I've written about and studied the American criminal justice system, not specific to New Mexico, but across the 50 states, about what we do with individuals at various points in criminal trials who are barely competent or not competent to stand trial. I don't like to use the word expert in regard to myself, but I have issued a few rulings over time in finding people, when I was a judge, for example, and finding people not competent to stand trial. Some of those cases are unlike what we have here because it was their first time in the system. But what we have here in this story is people going in and out of the system who aren't competent to stand trial. And then the criminal justice system isn't competent to adjudicate them as a result. And so there's this revolving door, usually low-level misdemeanor or felony cases of a nonviolent nature, but some of them are violent, and we're stuck in this, at this point, in this revolving door for a certain category of people.
Yeah. And Larry, you looked into a lot of case examples for this story, and you can see here for people watching, these are binders of just like the 24 that you took deep dives into. It's full from research that you've done for this reporting, and ultimately having to condense everything you learned into a 9-minute story for television. We know that's a long time in TV time, but obviously there's a lot more you couldn't fit in. So it struck me that some of the people that you featured in your report had more than 100 arrests. And same thing, they're released, case dismissed. Nothing seems to happen for them or the victims that could potentially be impacted by some of these crimes. But is there particularly anything egregious that struck you in your findings, in your research, that stuck out to you?
Well, I before we started looking into this issue, I really wasn't paying much attention to individuals who are mentally ill, who enter the criminal justice system, and what happens to them. Cases do get dismissed, but the numbers of cases for certain individuals is just, it's mind-boggling, honestly. We profiled one individual in our piece. He had more than 100 criminal cases, and this is just since 2018, so it's the last 7 years, more than 100 criminal cases. And every one of them was dismissed. He was released back into the community, and then short time later, sometimes it might be a few days, maybe a few weeks, but he's back, charged again. Now, on this individual that we profiled, and this individual is well known in the criminal justice system and to the police because he's been arrested so many times. He has been deemed to be incompetent to stand trial, and the only option for the courts, for the judges in these cases, is simply to dismiss the case and release him into the community. It is an incredible problem for the community, for the victims of the crimes, for the courts, and for the individuals. Honestly, it doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't get the individual who is having mental issues. It doesn't get them any help that they need. I don't know what the answer is. All we can do is present the facts and the problem. But some of these individuals, when you look at their court cases, it's everything from trespassing to burglary to assaults, domestic violence. We even profiled a couple of individuals who had been charged with murder, criminally ill, criminally incompetent, and then simply released.
Wow.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about watching your story was, the interviews you had with the local criminal justice leaders that really did agree. You've got the district attorney, Sam Bregman, in there, the head of the public defender's office, Ben Bauer, even former state police chief Pete Cassettis, who now has, moved from law enforcer to victim in the situation you presented there. They all agree the system is not set up to help either the victims or offenders in cases like this. It's a losing battle is really what it feels like for everyone. There's nowhere else for the folks to go other than the streets. Did you get a sense, though, from your interviews with these experts as to why that is? Why is there no other option at this point? Did any of them give you an idea?
That's such a difficult question.
I know.
Chris. the police, the judges, the prosecutors, they're all following the law.
Right.
There's no loophole in the law. The law is what it is, and this is what our legislature has deemed to be the law of the land. Everybody is following the law. So why do we still have this incredible problem? That would be a good question for Professor Kastenberg. I mean, what do you think?
Well, so, if we talk about the criminal justice system, we're talking about a system which is very individualized, and it's focused mainly on the defendant. We have a Bill of Rights in our United States Constitution. We have a more robust Bill of Rights in our New Mexico Constitution, but those rights are centered on people, on individuals, and they're called fair trial rights. You've got the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. Nowhere in there is a right of community safety. That's not something that the framers of either our state constitution or the U.S. Constitution. They were thinking in very elevated terms, and they weren't dealing with the problems of society that we have today. I mean, some people had crazy uncles, but either they took care of them, they put them in they put them in some very rudimentary, sort of unspeakable kind of, mental health treatment, if you want to call it that, or people just died off, or they went to the frontier and drunk themselves to death, or something like that. And so Larry's absolutely right. Every player, every entity, the prosecution, the police, the defense counsel, the judges are following the law. And one premise of that is, in the criminal justice system, you're presumed to have those fundamental rights. And first and foremost is that a person's innocent of a crime until the government proves them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous jury. If you can't go forward and assist in your own defense because you're not competent, if you can't understand the gravity of the crime, meaning right from wrong, under the various litmus tests that the law has, the law assumes you to be innocent, and therefore you enjoy the same freedoms as anyone else. But that never speaks to community safety. And, this isn't just mere theory, because anyone who's lived in Albuquerque now who's watching this understands, particularly if you're living in certain areas of the city, that the moment you go out of your front door, or if you're put in some unease and even potential danger by a group of people who don't, at this point in their lives, are not capable of understanding right from wrong, or even that they're acting within themselves. Right. And, for example, I go on Central Avenue every day, and, you see it outside of the campus. You see it outside of Nob Hill and those other areas. So the law is being followed. And one thing that we've never had in this country until recently are civil commitments, but those are outside of the justice system. We're not Finland or Norway or Sweden or Germany or Japan, that are very robust democracies. They're newer democracies than we are, but they have built into their system the ability for an adjudication system to decide, Lars Johansson is a danger to himself and his community, and we have an obligation to safeguard the community. We also have an obligation to try to get him better, and so we're going to put him into some mental health facility treatment and see if we can't find him gainful employment and improvement and the like. We have nothing like this, because that's a deprivation of liberty.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the issue of dangerousness too, because that's another facet of these cases. In New Mexico, if somebody is found incompetent to stand trial, meaning they can't participate in their own defense, but say they're also committing crimes that are violent in nature, there could be a dangerousness hearing where a judge can hear the facts and either rule, okay, this person is dangerous by the court standards or not. If a person is found dangerous and incompetent, they can be sent to the Behavioral Health Institute in Las Vegas, New Mexico. That's our state hospital, to be treated back to competency. But that's usually a temporary stay, right? Yeah. Can you tell us more about how that process works?
Well, this is a non-adversarial process. It doesn't really involve prosecutors and defense counsel. It's a adjunct to criminal justice, but it's outside of it. And that's an important point. An individual who's deemed to be dangerous under this process, this legal process we're talking about, has certain rights, and those rights are to challenge the diagnosis. The burden of proof and the burden of retaining someone is somewhat high, but it is a non-adversarial proceeding. And so judges are generally locked into what a treating psychiatrist or a psychologist will, issue as a diagnosis on that person. But, and this is the big sort of but that I'm going to say, even if someone is put away in a state facility for treatment, it's usually not permanent, and it's expensive, and the system is designed to get them out at the earliest possible moment, where there's a balancing between their rights and their safety to themselves and others. And so it works fundamentally different than a criminal justice system. It doesn't mean that they'll go back to doing what they were doing before, but there isn't the same kind of monitoring systems that go on when you have, a dangerous criminal. And I don't mean to make the comparison between child predators and mentally ill people, but if you think about someone who's victimized children, has to register, report into probation and parole type things, and they're tracked, right? Often tracked. They're supposed to be. Sometimes they fall through the system. That doesn't exist when you're talking about someone who's deemed innocent under the law, that same sort of oversight.
That's interesting, yeah.
So when we talk about being competent, what it means to be competent, by the court's definition, a reminder, it just sort of means that the suspect or defendant can participate in their own defense. But in many cases, it seems there are a lot of folks that cannot be treated back to competency.
Yeah, because you have to be able, there are certain fundamental decisions that a defendant, and only a defendant, can make. And first and foremost, among those two decisions, the two most important ones are, do I plead guilty or do I plead not guilty? Okay, that's the big one. No defense counsel, no prosecutor, the judge cannot bully a person into pleading. Defense counsel can advise, but that's all they can do. The second one, which is if a person pleads not guilty, which is absolutely critical, and it's a Fifth Amendment right, based on a Fifth Amendment right, is the right against self-incrimination. And what I mean by that is the second decision is, do I testify or not? I teach my students in criminal law this on the first day. A defense counsel has a lot of authority to decide what witnesses to call and what kind of closing argument to make, how to cross-examine the prosecutor's witness. But at the end of the day, there's one person in the courtroom who decides whether they testify or not, and that's the defendant. Now, the defendant has to have input in everything else the defense counsel is doing. Well, if you're not seeing reality, somebody could you can imagine a defendant saying, I'm the fifth daughter of the Aztec god of so-and-so, and I'm going to command the jury to acquit me, right? That is a disaster for the individual, for the idea of the Bill of Rights, or a disaster for the system as a whole.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
So we end up getting this revolving door, or the cycle there, where people are arrested and then let back out onto the streets. And Larry, I wanted to ask you, did you find out roughly how many people are being held long-term at the state hospital in Las Vegas, or what's called BHI sometimes? How does that compare, do you think, to the overall problem? How many people are being held? How does that compare to just how many people are out there?
Today, there are 65 individuals who are being held at the state hospital in Las Vegas, who have been held for an extended period of time. These are individuals who have committed egregious crimes, and they are being held to because it's been deemed that they are a danger to themselves or to others, and they are being held until or unless they become competent to stand trial. Now, probably the most notable example is John Hyde, who went in Albuquerque, went on this is 20 years ago, 2005. He went on a murderous rampage and murdered 6 individuals, including 2 police officers. He's never gone to trial on the murder charges. He is being held to this day at the state hospital, 20 years. He will probably spend the rest of his life at the state hospital. That's one example. So 65 individuals. In the scheme of things, when you look at all the individuals in the criminal justice system, 65 is not very many. I don't know if that sounds like a lot, but we're talking statewide. 65 individuals, mentally ill, have committed egregious crimes and have remained at the state hospital for extended periods of time, years. For most individuals who are sent to the state hospital, they are there for up to 9 months. So that's most of the mentally ill individuals go up there, and the maximum is 9 months.
Yeah. Were you going to add something?
I was going to say, you can take a look at the 65 individuals, and we can agree that their crimes were absolutely egregious. But if you take a look at the list and you see somebody's been arrested 100 times before, and most of them are misdemeanor crimes, but they're property crimes or they're vagrancy crimes, and yet they will keep. The system isn't designed to send them to the mental health treatment facility, and they'll keep doing that over and over again. And one element that we haven't discussed is what's the reaction of the community? Somebody who has kids, for example, and they're walking out their front door and they see one of these individuals acting violently, but maybe not actually being violent. There's a natural reaction, and we can't speak about this whole process expecting that society will exercise, 100% restraint, individuals when they're confronted by acts of apparent violence or acts that, of others that appear to be dangerous, the shouting at oneself sort of things and the like. And our system isn't designed to deal with any of that. And yet, I would just say this, the 65 individuals who are being held long-term, that's just a fraction of an overall much larger number of people who keep going in and out of the system.
Yeah. And as far as solutions, I think we can all agree this is a complex issue to solve when you're talking about mental health, civil rights, and the justice system. But it is an issue that lawmakers in New Mexico wanted to address this last legislative session. Professor Kastenberg, can you talk to us about what kinds of reforms lawmakers did pass this year and how new legislation will actually impact some of the cases that were highlighted in Larry's reporting, for example?
So I think, there's a greater amount of money, I suppose, at resources that are going to be dedicated. And there's a threshold of how people will be assessed in the courts that are changing. There's supposed to be a greater availability of diagnosis and the like to get people in the system. But we really won't know whether the success of the changes will occur or not for a while, because this is data-driven, these changes. One thing that we don't know and we don't have addressed particularly well is we live in a state where in certain areas of medical treatment, whether it's dermatology or certain kinds of cancer treatments, or mental health. We have an acute shortage of experts in the state. And all the legislation that's, crafted out of the good-hearted legislators won't fix the problem we're discussing about until that issue is addressed too. And I'm not convinced that any of the legislation we've passed is going to address that system at all.
Yeah. Larry, you said in your report that the judges were kind of hamstrung on what they can even decide to do with this person. Will they have more options now based on this legislation?
The answer is yes, they will have more options. But will the options make a difference, for example, to the individuals we profiled in our piece? The 24 individuals, we call them repeat offenders, but these are repeat defendants, honestly. Will the changes in the legislation, the reforms, if you like, make a difference perhaps down the road? But I don't anticipate seeing those changes in the next couple of years.
Okay.
Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah.
I think so.
It seems.
Yeah. That was how I was trying to couch my answer, too. We won't know if it's successful for a while.
Yeah.
And like you said, the judges might have an option to send somebody, to not jail or the streets, but the facility doesn't quite exist yet, maybe because we have such a shortage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a high percentage of people who are not insured medically in the state. We have a very high percentage of people against the national average who rely on Medicare and Medicaid. That isn't directly related to the issue we're talking about, but it frames the issue we're talking about because it shows that there's a greater, or I should say, there's an access to mental health deficit in the state in comparison to some other states that don't have the shortages that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
One of the questions I get from a lot of folks, people who have seen our story, and as I was working on this, is if somebody is mentally ill, why can't you force them to get treatment?
Yeah, that's actually literally the next question I had here. It's a great question. Yeah.
And I think that, Josh, that's a good question for you, is why can't you just make them take medication or get treatment to make them competent?
Yeah, so, we again, the whole constitutional legal system that we live under is a system based on individual rights. And the law has been very reticent, judges and Congress and the state legislatures, to be able to force an individual to take drugs to make them competent to stand trial. Now, it's possible to do that. If a psychologist or a psychiatrist testifies that a defendant is malingering, it opens the door to that being a possibility. I think almost all of our watchers or listeners have probably seen a Law and Order episode or an NYPD or something else where the prosecutors throw up their hands and they say, there's nothing we can do about it. And the judges, are sort of apologetic and they'll say, I can't force so-and-so to take medication. The truth is there is a very narrow door where that can happen, but that narrow door has to come with a diagnosis of, number one, is there a close to certainty that treatment will get somebody into the competency stage? Okay, so that's a high burden. The other high burden, because mental health doesn't work in certainties. I mean, we're not talking about, the tensile strength of a bridge, right? It doesn't work that way. It works in probabilities. The other aspect of it is the person malingering or treatable? And those are two different things as well. Malingering is a conscious decision not to seek help, knowing that a person, knowing that the person could seek help or take drugs. That's fundamentally different. That's a very narrow diagnosis compared to somebody, if we send them to this drug treatment or this therapy, then there's a reasonable probability that they'll become, competent. Those are, like I said, those are two completely different things.
Larry, you interviewed a victim in your story about her ex-husband who sent her threatening message, threatening to kill her.
One of them said specifically, "This is a threat. I am going to hunt you down and put a couple of bullets in your brain."
Do you believe that your husband was going to kill you?
Yes.
The woman's ex has competency issues, but a judge in his case did not find him dangerous, and he was recently released back to the streets. The victim, Julie Turner, told you, quote, "It's really unfortunate. Everybody loses here. I lost as a victim because he's out on the street. He lost by being out on the street because he has nowhere to go. Therefore, he has nothing to lose." So that sounds like a pretty scary situation to be in. Has she heard from him now that you know of, that he's out? And how is she feeling about that?
Well, she's pretty disappointed. She was at the hearing where the judge ruled at the dangerousness hearing that it was a day-long hearing, and the judge ruled after reviewing the text messages, and there were 50 text messages to his ex-wife in which he threatened harm to his ex-wife, to police officers, to prosecutors, and they were pretty explicit about what he intended to do. The judge reviewed the text messages and ruled that this individual was not dangerous. As a result of that, he was released. Now, this really just happened in the last couple of weeks. So the victim here, at the last time I spoke to her, which was shortly before our story aired, had not heard from her ex-husband, but she has taken precautions. She knew that he was going to be released, and so she has taken personal precautions to protect her safety. Is she scared about it? You bet. You bet. What can she do about it?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it does feel like, based on the reporting here and really like kind of the description of how the system works now, it really seems like the threshold for the court to order someone into a treatment facility is pretty high. And it seems kind of harsh to say this, but I feel that in some sense, it seems as if someone who's legally incompetent in the criminal sense, they've either got to seriously hurt or maybe even kill somebody for a judge to be able to say, keep them in jail or in a long-term treatment facility. Again, sounds harsh, but is that a fair assessment?
Are we waiting for someone to get hurt? Yeah.
Yeah, well, the criminal justice system is reactive. It's not proactive. I mean, it's designed to deter people from doing wrongdoing. So, like, if somebody goes to jail for 10 years because they've committed an act of violence, or they've trafficked in arms, in theory, people are supposed to say, I don't want to be that person, right? So they'll be dissuaded. But when you're talking about competency and you're talking about categories of people who already are not living and visualizing the reality that the majority of human beings do, deterrence isn't a factor in their life. That's not a consideration. And so we're kind of stuck with that, with that very real kind of aspect of this, of what we're talking about here.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
And I think this brings up the point. One of the questions we haven't directly addressed is the difference between how you treat somebody who's charged with a felony versus a misdemeanor. There's a pretty big difference, as I understand, when it comes to competency. Can you just sort of explain that to us, Professor?
Well, fundamentally, a person has to be able to understand right from wrong and has to be able to assist in their own defense. And that doesn't change between the felony and the misdemeanor. But the thing is that with most misdemeanors, there's no jail time. I mean, under the criminal statutes, a person can go to jail. But misdemeanors, if if the system starts putting people who've committed misdemeanors wholesale into jails, there's never enough space. And so usually misdemeanors tend to be what you call sort of diversionary or deterrent based. So there isn't the safeguarding guardrails, I would say, in terms of misdemeanor cases when you have people who are incompetent, as there would be naturally with felonies. Plus, no felony can go to trial in the state system without a grand jury or an information hearing, and that's a question that comes up at the very beginning. A misdemeanor just basically is charged and goes to trial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in this case, a lot of times it just seems like misdemeanors are the ones that go away relatively quickly, whereas felonies, more serious crimes, sometimes there's some nuance there into whether or not treatment happens, but oftentimes, as we're seeing, even felonies end up going away.
Well, let me ask, if you have an individual who is charged with a misdemeanor and they are found to be incompetent, what are the options for the judge in those cases?
Well, if they're found to be incompetent, the option for the judge is simply to release them. I mean, misdemeanors inherently are not violent crimes, and so the thought process behind a misdemeanor, they're usually petty property crimes or vagrancy crimes. Anything from public intoxication to
criminal damage,
or shoplifting, minor amounts of things like that. So the thought is, well, they're not a danger to society. We just release them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where you get the revolving door and so many repeat offenders.
Yeah.
From the woman in your story, Larry, who's afraid of running into a person she knows is mentally unstable, who's threatened her, from business owners who we've talked to in our own reporting too, who've had their places broken into repeatedly, deal with the same issues and people over and over. These issues do seem to be impacting all different factions of society. You mentioned families with kids. That's a new territory I'm navigating now with a 6-year-old, with real potential victims and real victims. There's probably more we can talk about here, but I'll ask you both, is there anything we're missing that you want to share or want people to better understand about this issue?
Well, I would urge our viewers to, if you haven't seen the report that we did, is take a look at the report and take a look at some of the video that we posted on the KRQE website. These are actual arrest videos of individuals who are mentally ill. They're being arrested, taken into custody, and honestly, it's hard to watch. This is hard to watch. We've all probably seen mentally ill individuals on the street. These are individuals who are being taken into custody. Take a look at these videos. It is an eye-opener, and it is tough to watch. But it really brings the issue home, is how do you deal with the mentally ill when they've been charged with crimes? It was an education for me over the last 9 months. And it really opened my eyes to the issue. The solutions are complex. I don't think anybody has the answer. There's no magic law that's going to solve this problem. It's not going to happen. The reality is this is so difficult to deal with, but it is definitely a major issue for everybody. They need to be aware of how the justice system deals with individuals who are mentally ill but are in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, this is, I think for me, the takeaway for our watchers is there's no simple solution to this. Oftentimes when there's an issue in the law, a legislator or a pundit will say, we can fix it by doing A, but that's not the case here. It's usually not the case anywhere, but it's certainly not the case in this issue. Not only are there no simple solutions, and we've touched upon some of the issues, a shortage of mental health in the state, the focus on the we're looking at the revolving door, but the focus on the rights of the individual is going to remain. That can't erode. But the commitment of the legislature, of the taxpayers, to have a realization that you can't penny packet solutions. You have to have sort of a holistic one. And then the idea of the end goal in this, it's both the safeguarding of society, but also getting people into competency or into a point where they won't commit crimes anymore. That is a major, major undertaking that's incredibly complex, but also can't be solved overnight. It's got to be over a long duration.
Yeah, it's kind of depressing outlook y'all are painting here, but yes.
I'm just going to add here. I think that it is a complex problem, and it's also an the fix is very, very pricey. Politically, putting funding towards mental health is not very popular. That's one of the difficulties. It is going to take a ton of money to reform the system that we have. Is that what the voters want? Is it going to pass? It's not popular in the legislature. Not to put legislators would much prefer to give teachers raises, tax cuts, and that sort of thing. When you say we're going to appropriate millions of dollars towards a mental health treatment program, is that going to be politically? Is that going to get them reelected? Probably not.
Why? Why do you think that is?
Well, it's expensive, and taxpayers tend not to vote for legislators who appropriate large amounts of monies and raise taxes at the same time for things that aren't readily ascertainable. And I remember a friend of mine in Los Angeles, and I can't remember what major sports team was looking to move, said it's easier to convince a community to build a new stadium than it is to build a mental health facility. And I think that's true, even knowing the new stadium is going to come with increased DUIs, other kinds of crimes, traffic congestion, and the like. But people can see, new home of the Los Angeles whatever, the Dodgers or the Lakers or whatever. The idea that there's civic pride in a mental health treatment facility, unfortunately, we don't live in that kind of environment, and so that is not something that individual legislators are going to champion.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you bringing this story here to light, Larry. I think it's a very clear example of just the challenges that are facing, the police officers and then also the folks who are victimized by this, and as well the health system in general. And then as well, Professor Kastenberg, thank you for sharing your expertise in this subject matter, especially around criminal law, because it's complex, as we've said.
Thank you.
So thank you both.
You bet. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Larry Barker and Professor Joshua Kastenberg for joining us in an extended conversation about what really is a complex issue. When we turned off the recording, I mentioned we didn't even touch on the drug issue that's impacting a lot of this population, and fentanyl, methamphetamine, that's a whole different facet.
In the sense that it changes brain chemistry so much so that a person is no longer the person that they were after this.
Yeah, and it's really hard to, like we talked about, being treated back to competency. Addiction is a whole other, we've done episodes on that, so certainly feel free to go back in your feed and listen to those. But
and I think what would be an interesting thing to even look into and sort of a call out to those folks who are listening is that once these community programs that were part of the new legislative bill that passed this session, once those do start to take shape, seeing how they work, and maybe that is an episode something we'll try to cover here down the line.
For sure.
Yeah, if you have any ideas, let us know at KRQE. I'm at Chris McKee TV, also chris.mckee at krqe.com.
And I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart at krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. Thank you all for listening and watching.